Hello, and welcome to the third edition of What Has the Environment Ever Done for Us? For this month's edition, we have a finance special. We will get through our usual order, headlines, hero, and hypocrisy, but we're absolutely delighted to welcome Helena Anderson from Ikigai Capital, who we will come to very shortly. But first of all, let's start off with Mr. Mitchell. Please, headlines of the month, please.
Okay, Johnny, so just very briefly, we've got much more important things to come to, obviously, but this week saw the publication of a report by the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, who were saying that we need to spend somewhere in the order of $7 trillion every year on infrastructure to address climate change. And it goes on to discuss what sort of infrastructure that might be. I was very interested in reading this because our very own Association of Consulting Engineering also recently published a similar document called Project Speed. Now, I'm not sure if there's anything in this, but the current person who leads FIDIC, the International Federation, is somebody called Nelson Ogenshakin, who not long ago left the ACE from there as being their chief executive, and now our very own managing director, Paul Riley, is chairman of the ACE. And they published something called Project Speed. And this explores what they call practical steps that need to be taken to unlock delivery, to get faster, better, greener investment in infrastructure, specifically in rail, homes, hospitals, and schools. Now, they talk about strengthening the evidence base and making better use of data in project development, digitizing what I would probably call the historically arcane processes involved in developing new projects, and focusing decision-making around a new approach to value-based decision-making, which goes purely beyond the financial aspects. All of this, however, talks about the speed and the volume that we need to approach the issue about infrastructure delivery. And it begs the question about, so what infrastructure do we need to deliver that requires these massive, fast, and urgent programs? And I think there's a complicated picture that sits behind this, particularly here in the UK. The recent engagement of organisations such as the Friends of the Earth and the Transport Action Network and others in challenging what major infrastructure decisions are being made, together with the effects of the pandemic, has had a really big influence on what projects are being promoted to be delivered. For example, Friends of the Earth successfully challenged the airport's national policy statement last year at the Court of Appeal. And having done that, the Secretary of State said that he wouldn't challenge that decision, although Heathrow did decide to challenge that and got the decision overturned at the Supreme Court. Even then, John Holland-Kaye, the chief executive, confirmed that Heathrow won't be pursuing a third runway for at least 15 years. So having been 2 years ago in a process of rapid delivery of a third runway for Heathrow, we now found ourselves in a position of no third runway at Heathrow for 2 years. What else is in store for us? Well, we continue to see the Transport Action Network challenging Highways England, for example, about their roads investment strategy, their second roads investment strategy, on the basis that it doesn't comply with the Paris Agreement or similar circumstances. And given that the original decision as to whether or not there was compliance with the Paris Agreement made at Heathrow was made at a time when policy was quite formative. Now here we are on the approach to COP26 in Glasgow with our commitments around Paris more clearly understood. Do we really understand what infrastructure under the heading of roads, given the big disruption that we've got coming up in terms of transport over the next few years, what is going to happen over the next 2 or 3 years as we try and make decisions about new infrastructure that needs to be delivered? It's a fascinating area. It's full of new policy areas. It's full of new legal challenges. and it's full of decision making on a basis that we don't yet quite understand.
Wow. Yeah.
There, is that okay? That sounded like a great webinar.
Yeah, it puts you on the back foot a little bit, doesn't it, with regard to the just the whole system thinking on that.
Well, I think we've got an hour, right? We should be able to get through pretty much everything to solve that problem.
Yeah. Excellent. Right, I'm making notes.
Yeah, I'm going to have to pause you on that because I owe Nick an enormous apology, because I also forgot to introduce at the beginning that Nick has read a book this month, and he's desperate to share this.
No, I'm waiting. I can wait.
You're waiting.
I'm just thinking about the enormity of the idea that people are now brave enough and determined enough to challenge policy, and they're not willing to just take it on the chin. Now, whether 7 trillion, it's interesting. 7 trillion seems to be the new 1 billion mark. It's because in my book that I read, I'm sure I could find the figure 7 trillion is in there. So obviously that's the new trendy phrase. But it is amazing with the Heathrow and with other government policies, people are now really gearing themselves up to take the policymakers to task, which from my reading, I now understand is much more important than I'd given credit to before.
Well, I think there's a bit of spin in there, if I may, because the Heathrow decision was not based on the Paris Agreement. It was based on whether or not the national planning statements apply to Heathrow. And it was a very legal, very technical matter that determined that. But people are catching on to it because they want to see aviation decarbonised. And so it's a useful event that can be spun in a way that demonstrates that NGOs have an impact.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
This would be a very tough webinar. This would be
I'd be delighted. I actually read the judgment. And you're absolutely right. It turned on a very specific interpretation about whether or not our compliance with the Paris Agreement was considered to be national policy or not. Because if it was considered national policy, then the national policy statement had to comply. If it didn't, it didn't. And that was sort of a bit of a reference to arcane processes in a sense, because actually there's some hugely important decisions that we've got to make over the course of the next few years.
What I think is worth noting about that, because maybe it leads us into the discussion about infrastructure. Not that I want to. Obviously I can't wait my turn, but I'm very passionate about aviation, and I just want to make one point, because this links into a lot of the work that needs to be done on the ground around decarbonisation of such an important industry. And while that decision had absolutely nothing to do with how we were going to achieve our carbon targets, what happened is that everybody interpreted it as being a trend. And therefore, you have airports all around the country, and we work with a number of them with Stantec, who have taken that as no planning decisions were made in favour of expansion of airports. This is obviously pre-COVID, but similar considerations now in terms of the licence to operate, that those planning decisions will simply not get through unless there is a serious consideration of a sustainable framework for growth. And almost immediately after that decision, we collectively were approached to look at how you can finance decarbonisation, diversify revenue streams, and in a post-COVID environment, that's only intensified. So whether or not it was a technical legal decision is neither here nor there now. The airline industry, the airport industry has understood that they are not going to survive. It is an existential crisis for them post-COVID, that either they go jet zero or they go home. So the thing that I find frustrating on behalf of the industry, though, is that there's a lot of talk about R&D, and I'm sure we'll get onto that with Nick's book, but there's a real focus on how you change the tech. But unless you change the infrastructure around the tech is not possible. So it's the much less sexy infrastructure that we need to be talking about to have our airports and our ports ready for the carbon transition. But it's not as exciting as Friends of the Earth complaining about a third runway at Heathrow or talking about the latest hydrogen plane. So we tend not to talk about it.
And,
Yeah.
and to segue very nicely into the next section, Helena, as well, do we also not need to completely change the way that that industry is financed too? And I don't answer that question just now, because I think it's probably time actually that we properly introduce you to our audience. And I'm going to pass over at this point to our colleague Jenny to pick up the baton on that one and get into the nitty-gritty about yourself and Ikigai Capital. Jenny.
Great, thanks Johnny, thanks everyone. Okay, I'll step back a little bit and then perhaps we can get back to some heated debate. So Helena, thank you so much for joining us. Helena founded Ikigai Capital back in 2017 after 2 years working at the UK Department for International Trade, where she was the head of energy capital investment. Helena, can you please tell us a little bit about Ikigai Capital and your work?
With pleasure. I'm not quite sure where to start, so maybe I will start with our mission and what Ikigai means, because that might frame the discussion. So Ikigai is a Japanese word, and it means loosely reason for living. And I set up Ikigai in the wake of the passing of my life partner. So on a very personal level, it has meaning to me. But I also set it up as someone who was a bit of a Japanophile my whole life, who worked a great deal with Japanese investors when I was in government, looking at how to attract capital into the UK to drive the energy transition. Because Japan is a major investor in all the tech across the energy transition space, and they have a wall of institutional capital that's looking for markets to get higher returns. So there was a real kind of Japanese flavour to what we were doing. But the philosophy of Ikigai is really, really important to what we do. Ikigai at its core means that to be happy in life, one must do what they are good at, what they're passionate about, where their skills lie, and what makes money. And so it's these pillars of Ikigai that drive the work that we do. And when I was in government, I noticed that there was a particular niche that was not being filled by the private sector or by anyone, by government as well, that was this bridge between investors, users of energy, major users of energy, so infrastructure players like airports and ports, as well as energy-intensive industry, the innovators of the world, the tech companies, and government. And so what we try and do at Ikigai is we try and bridge that gap, but we bridge it from a financing perspective. So we're all ex-finance professionals. Myself, I was a lawyer for 15 years in project finance. My business partner, Roberto, he was previously a banker and a fund manager. So we're not coming at it from the perspective of a technical and engineering thought process. We're coming at it from the perspective of how do you join the dots across those stakeholders? How do you solve some of the gaps in the market around commercialization of tech, supporting local authorities to make the right decisions to attract private sector investment into the energy transition, working with investors to understand how they can decarbonize their portfolios and fund that on a third-party finance basis, help industry to understand what technology should apply and how they can get that funded. That's kind of our focus. And it sort of reflects the 4 pillars of Ikigai, which is the reason we set up the business. So when I was in government, we used to talk about this conveyor belt, or 2 conveyor belts actually. One where you're dragging institutional money, lower cost capital, further and further along the risk curve so that they become more and more engaged in the energy transition. So you're moving money from pension funds and insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds, some of the big strategic investors. You're moving their money towards where the tech and the projects need to move in this direction. So they need to become more bankable using proven technology. The technology itself has to be commercialized and ready for use in a project finance environment. So if you can get those 2 conveyor belts to converge, which is what we're trying to do at Ikigai, then you can deliver projects at scale, and you can do it with innovative technology, but in a bankable way.
Thank you so much for that background, because that was a really interesting visual analogy for me, because I've heard other people talking similarly about it's high risk. I remember them talking about the offshore wind and trying to get floating offshore wind to take off, but no one's ever put it in that way in terms of trying to bring these two areas together in that way. So yeah, thank you for that. So I think it would be really interesting for some of our listeners and for everyone on the call to hear a little bit about the projects that you're actually involved in. Would you be happy to talk about a couple of those?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I understand you have lots of local authority listeners on your podcast, so maybe I'll focus on the work that we're doing with local authorities and local enterprise partnerships, because that's been a really important part of our growth over the last few years. One of the trends that was absolutely key for me and a focus for Ikigai was on energy-led industrial clusters. When I was in government, I helped to draft the industrial strategy, and so that really informed our thinking about the dual trends of decarbonisation and devolution. And where you see those two trends coming together in the UK is in industrial cluster work, city solution work, and district work. And so we're doing projects with technical advisors across all of those sort of subsets. So we're working in Cheshire in the northwest on an industrial decarbonisation route map for the industrial zone around there, which is one of the 6 industrial clusters as identified by government. And we're putting together the pipeline of projects, both ones that have been identified by stakeholders locally and ones that we've kind of created with a blank sheet of paper because we think that they're what the area needs to decarbonise across all energy vectors. So one of the core aspects of what we do is always focusing on energy systems. So we don't look at just power or just heat or just transport and fuel vectors. We're looking across the piece because that's what's necessary for industrial decarbonisation. And our focus is on how do you create a capital investment plan around bankable projects and then bring the private sector in to deliver it. So very, the boring nuts and bolts of how you convert 7 trillion scale of investment into smaller projects that are actually creating the conditions for building blocks towards the energy transition. In Scotland, we're working on the Glasgow Climate Neutral Innovation District, which is a core plank of COP26, which is the district in the centre of Glasgow, looking again from an all-vector basis at how we create bankable solutions for decarbonisation. They're more of a mixed-use residential type environment with a couple of major industrial stakeholders and a big hospital. In Manchester, we're doing a heat network in the centre of town or the southern corridor of Manchester, which is both power and heat. So it's not just a heat network, it also includes private wire. So we're getting to grips with how a heat network or a private wire network expands over time across different types of energy users, starting with hospital, moving on to more residential, moving on to more industrial scale energy use. And we've just been appointed to advise the Thames Estuary Growth Board, which is the public-private partnership, if you like, that's been pulled together to deliver, amongst other things, a hydrogen ecosystem for the Thames Estuary and a capital investment plan to deliver that. So I'm sure that there are various perspectives on this call that will have very, very relevant insights to all of those. I guess the one that you were very interested in, Jenny, was Net Zero Leiston, which is probably the last I would mention, which is a net zero town in Suffolk that we're working on a not-for-profit basis with EDF as one of the private sector sponsors. Leiston happens to be near Sizewell, the nuclear power station, but actually this project is independent of that, and it's looking at how what are the optimal structures for decarbonising a small town that's largely residential focused. So you notice when I'm always talking about what's the asset class, because that's how investors think. It's not really about just the tech, it's about how that tech is applied in an asset class context, and then how do you make that asset class viable, because our investors are organised to think in that way. And so what we're trying to do with NZL is to create a prototype which is replicable across the country, and then to reach out to local authorities across the country and pull them into the project so that we can create the sort of scale that makes residential decarbonisation on a 5,000 homes basis interesting to very large investors.
That's really interesting. And well, you've talked about a whole range of interesting projects there. Just touching on that point about local authorities and areas trying to decarbonise, from my perspective, it's quite a complex picture. It's a big challenge. It's got to be delivered over time. Have you got any thoughts or any advice for where to start, maybe drawing on that project you were just talking about?
Yeah, well, where to start depends on what your problem is. So where to start is understanding the problem at a granular level. Yeah. And I guess what you're picking up on there, Jenny, is one of the things that was fundamental when we set up Ikigai, and actually came about because my business partner, Roberto, he called me one day in government before we were working together, and he said, you know, data is really important. I really think that everything related to the energy transition, it all comes back to data. Energy DNA, that's the future. And at the time, I really didn't understand what he was saying, and I think I nodded and vaguely took notes. But in hindsight, it was probably the most important thing that anyone had ever said to me, as the basis on which we now engage with asset owners, investors with diversified portfolios. And the first thing we say is, do you really know what's going on in your business as far as energy consumption is concerned? And usually they say, well, I've got, half-hour meters. And I think when they installed that kit, they put some sort of sensor on it. So, we're tracking whether or not it's performing, that piece of kit. Yeah. And like, okay, so you don't know what's happening across all these different types of energy vector or temperature or vibrations. So how are you doing predictive maintenance? And they usually look at you blankly. And they can't tell you exactly why they're spending so much money on certain aspects of their energy budget. So somebody comes along and says, hey, we build solar plants. Do you want one? And they say, I guess, what harm can it do? But they haven't actually solved their carbon problem in doing that, because they haven't understood that maybe their biggest issue is around heat loss. Or somebody comes along and says, hey, you should change your boiler, but they haven't realized that they're in another process in their business. They're generating huge amounts of waste heat that they could be capturing and using instead. So without understanding at a granular level what's going wrong, you don't make the best investment decisions. And so from a funder perspective, we would always say, you need to know what your problem is before you can look at what the solution is and how you can move forward to actually deliver it. And from a financing perspective, that de-risks the whole structure, because you know from the word go exactly what vectors you need to control in whatever solution you deliver. So I would always say we need to know more. Digitization, digital twinning, IoT platforms, all of that, those buzzwords, they're buzzwords for a reason, because you have to understand your business before you can do anything about it. And then the second thing I would say is that we focus a lot, sorry to come back to the 7 trillion, but we focus a lot on scale, because everybody is incredibly excited once you've got 100 million or 300 million pound project. People will throw resources at it, even when it's completely, a vanity project, when they don't realize that sometimes it's the little interventions which prove a business case on a structural level that then lead to all of the momentum that you need to actually deliver at scale. So I'll give you an example on Thames Estuary. One of the first things that we're doing is we're looking at the capacity at a port level of switching equipment, so cranes and other constant use equipment, switching that across to hydrogen fuel cells. Why? Because I know that in a high use environment like that, I can demonstrate the business case on day one for switching across to hydrogen fuel cells. So if we can demonstrate that at one port, because they could finance it using third-party finance on a very well-structured basis with a credit-worthy counterparty over long term with stable cash flows, if I can do that with no government intervention, then all the 3 other ports that are in the immediate facility will say, well, why haven't we got that? And once they've done that, they've already installed the necessary IoT solutions to understand what they're doing. So you're halfway there. Then you move on to the things that actually require government intervention beyond what already exists. But if you never get people using the tech in a way that makes sense for their business, you never move forward. So, you know, I understand why we talk about scale, because that's how you move huge amounts of institutional capital. And obviously we subscribe to that as well. But actually there's some beauty in the tiny little interventions and the complexity involved in seeing how they work as a system, which actually can really transform an economy very, very quickly.
I think you've really struck a chord with some of the previous conversations we've had on this webinar, where we've been talking about it's really important to try and drive to action. It doesn't need to be huge scale action first, but you do need to sort of direct your efforts in the right way. Therefore, you, as you were saying there, you need to understand your situation in the first place. And unfortunately, sometimes we see, I think, well-intentioned efforts, but they get a bit misguided towards jumping to a solution like PV, or let's just put in renewable energy, rather than let's look at energy efficiency first, what's actually going to be cost effective and have the best social environmental outcomes. And some of that's driven by balance sheet funding, so you're looking at payback periods rather than looking at what is the rate of return for an external investor. So sometimes you make decisions on that basis. But to be honest, the government's not helping. So the funding announcements that they made in the wake of COVID, though well-intentioned to try and drive money into local authorities as quickly as possible, they said to a number of local authorities that we work with, the most ridiculous statement I've ever heard: if you've got shovel-ready projects, we'll fund them. Well, how on earth do you think we got shovel-ready projects when we didn't have any funding to do feasibility work? And you haven't given us any time to engage with private sector stakeholders in order to pull something together. So we can't just magic up the need for 100 million overnight. And if we don't do that, then we won't get it. So we come up with some scheme that looks like it's shovel ready, but hasn't really been thought through. Or we put in our own land to deliver a solution, even when that land is not the optimal way in which you might deliver an EV network or EV charging network or what have you, because that's the way you get something together to meet a grant requirement within a month. That is incredibly bad planning, and it creates terribly perverse incentives that aren't ultimately going to support the growth of a decarbonised economy. Okay.
So I think what you said, Helena, one of the things there that cracks me up is this expression "shovel ready" becomes the new kind of name of the time, isn't it? At the moment, everything, you know, I'll give you £300 million if you can give me some shovel ready projects.
Out of school, but I promise to give you some controversy on this thing. As you know, I used to work in the Department for International Trade, and hopefully no one from there is listening to this call.
Don't worry, it'll be put on a website, you'll be fine.
Maybe we can edit this out. So we had a directive. You know, when I started there, we were trying to do what only government can do. That was our mantra: only do what only government can do. I don't do what the Green Investment Bank did. We then changed, the strategy then changed just before I left, to only work on shovel-ready projects. And I would say, well, you've now put me in a position where I'm competing with 1, 2, 3 people, with JP Morgan and Rothschilds and you name any investment bank on the block, because that's what they want. They want shovel-ready projects that they can put in front of their pension funds. What government's supposed to be doing is taking what's the expression, the pig's ear into a whatever
princess purse.
That's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be pulling together the difficult things that wouldn't otherwise be done, which hence why we set up Ikigai, because we're trying to fix that problem. But the point is, that's exactly where government should be intervening and putting in the hard yards where it won't otherwise be done, but it has massive economic benefits.
Vicky, at this point, I'd like to bring the politician in the room into that conversation. Have you got any views on that, shovel ready or not?
I feel that pain, I really do. Last year when we had exactly that, with the local enterprise partnership money running out, and if you don't spend it by the 31st of March, it's gone, and you're like, okay, so you're going to pull our money away, but now you're asking us to come up with some new projects which have had no due diligence done on them, and then turn them around in at the end of the tail, I mean, what's the point? You might as well just extend the time. So that is just music to my ears, and will be music to the ears of all council leaders. But I suppose the answer to that is, what is the solution?
Well, I should say I give enormous credit to Cheshire and Warrington and the whole of the Northwest, but particularly Cheshire and Warrington Lab and the Thames Estuary, because they are genuinely trying to push back on that and say, okay, well, the way that the world works when you're developing projects is as follows. What we need to do is bring in some specialist support to help those on the ground who are trying to do their best in industry and in government to actually shape really strong, well-structured projects, so that we can then decide what do we need public sector funding to do and what can we actually take to the private sector, because it's so well structured we can bring in that institutional money, rather than assuming that unless you grab at that grant, there'll be no other money. Actually, there's a wall of money out there. It just needs good projects. And so if you support those projects to come through targeted feasibility study work, working with the private sector, but pushing it into the areas that have the greatest benefit from a socioeconomic perspective, then you really drive forward a huge pipeline. That's what we're seeing in Cheshire and what we're seeing in Thames.
Nick, you were leaning in there.
I was leaning in, and because I've read this book, and I know we're all joking about it because I am delighted to have read this book. Can I go on to do a bit about the book, because I think it leads into some of the issues that we're getting into.
Go on.
So I have
you know this book?
Which book are you talking about?
Come on, Keith, you've got it as well, haven't you?
And we're doing an act for Bill Gates.
I want to start off, if I can, by apologising to everyone who's been campaigning, been studying and developing an understanding of climate change and its potential effects on our world for all their lives, because I've just woken up to what you've been doing and I really appreciate it. And I apologise that only now have I got an enthusiasm from a book by a computer geek. But one of the things I do think that Bill Gates has possibly done is there will undoubtedly be reasons to argue and debate things in this book. And actually, having worked in politics for the last 12 years, there is no single policy that is unanimously accepted by anyone in this world. There is always someone who thinks you're barking mad and they'll vote for the other party. So let's accept that this will not be unanimously agreed. What I do love about it is it's like switching on a computer and finding Windows loads up and you click a mouse and it does something that only Bill Gates could have created. Before that, computers were a mystery to me. It gets into the details of what a lot of people watching this know and have lived with and have had to struggle over endless conversations. It shows that fossil fuels have been adopted for nations who wanted to grow quickly. And that's a really hard thing for a country that wants to be more economically powerful than it is, to look at China and see how it's done it on the back of fossil fuels and then being told you can't have that. It's the longevity of carbon, the understanding of it. All of this is known by all of you. I'm just a numpty in the room, I'm the dunce. But it's a clear book that's easy to read, and it gives you information that really fills it in so that you're confident of perhaps looking to the future about adaptation and migration, migrating the whole issues. And what I felt comforting about this was he told me that in this book, reading it, that actually there aren't solutions to some of the problems, but we've got to find them and we've got to have a plan for finding them. But in the meantime, there's lots of things we can do. And some of those actually cause problems. So to electrify all the cars in this country will cause an increase in electricity demand. And we will struggle to deliver that with completely clean electricity. And there's a whole issue behind that. And so none of this is straightforward in any shape or form. I think that the book says you can't achieve any of this without consensus. And I think that what he's tried to do is create a framework that we can debate more cleanly what the issues are that we have to get consensus on. And the consensus is not just with the politicians, it's with us who vote them in, because at the end it comes through about our own influence on this. Go on, Vicky.
I think that's the point in what Helena was just saying, was about, you know, a lot of, forgive me, Helena, but a lot of what you said to me went in one ear and out the other, because it was finance speak. And because it was, but in order to get the funding, you have to convert this stuff into the language that those financiers understand, talking about those assets and the portfolio. And what Bill Gates has done is he's turned it into our speak. You know, I now can explain to anybody that how you make cement, you know, and that actually, or no, how you make concrete. And I can now work out that really simple equation about, you know, where carbon comes in. I couldn't have done that before the weekend. But if people like you and me are able to do that, then perhaps we can then process some of the more complicated stuff, because we go, okay, it's now not totally foreign. And it is about getting the right language to the right people so that we can switch on. Helena's clients won't switch on if you don't speak their language. And I think that's what Bill Gates's book unlocks, is that language.
Hold that thought, because I want to just get through a few more things, because I think that one of the other issues I really found great value in this book was he broke it down for me in digestible sizes. You know, the issues about climate change and the greenhouse gases. You know, there's aspects we can do in power. There's aspects we can do in making things. There's aspects we can do in the poor old cows. I felt so sorry for cows, because they've got to go. They've got to.
Come on, Nick.
Off with the cow.
Project right now is a circular economy project for the dairy industry. Please don't deprive me of that.
No, but interesting point about that was, as I read this story and I understood that implication, which, you know, I'd heard it all before. I've heard lots of this before. I then started thinking about what are we going to do to help all those farmers? How are we going to help those sectors during a transition period? Because that is seriously something that has to be addressed. But then going on to
Can I tell you why he's wrong about that?
What's wrong about that?
Well, because when you think as a system, you don't necessarily need to kill off the industries that give us such socioeconomic benefits as the dairy industry, for example. So in a world where you think that anything that, well, what we're doing is we're decarbonising power, then you look at the dairy industry and you go, we've got massive methane problem, it's polluting the waterways, how can we possibly sustain this industry in a decarbonised world? But actually now we're getting to the point where we're looking at so many different technologies that can actually decarbonise that industry as a system, that we actually have the hope of saving the value that lies in these.
And I don't disagree, but the system, what I'm concerned about is that we're dealing with a lot of things not in a holistic view.
No, we're not.
And that danger is that without the holistic view, we start to see people falling in the cracks. Now, one of the things that he goes on to say, which again, I've heard this before, I worked on a project to do with Bangladesh, you know, are we working out where the people of Bangladesh are going to live? Because the speed at which we are going to save them from the rising water is not necessarily fast enough to stop that. And where are the Fenlands going to go? Where are all the Fenland farmers going in Cambridgeshire? And the Dutch, bit of an issue with the Dutch, we've got to help them. So there's areas of, it's not just in one area that we have to come up with a plan. We have to adapt the world in which we're living. We have to adapt the way we're working in the meantime. I think that the ultimate thing that I came up with was it's a plan for getting to zero. It's the first time someone's presented me with a plan that had a holistic view about it, that was looking at everything in your way as a system, but it was coming up with the bigger system that I could buy into. And I really welcomed that. And I really welcomed the description of what a business could do, what a government could do, which I think is coming back to what you were frustrated with the government about where they fit in, and what we could do. And one of the interesting things he says, and I don't want to be a spoiler to all the what's in the book, and I haven't, there's no way you could do it, is about we need to start telling our leaders and everything, and for me, local government, about there is a holistic view we have to have. In local government, there are some really great ones. In fact, I read an article about someone in a London council whose job is about decarbonising the council. Fantastic. But it has to be in every aspect of that council's leadership. That has to be a member of the strategic direction of the council. It is not a junior role. And I think we had this conversation off level, you know, hiring someone here is lovely. You patted on the head of all the people in the lobbying groups, but actually the chief executive, someone very close to the chief executive, should be in that management system saying every decision we make has to stop saying we've understood what we do to the environment, but we actually now have to know that we're doing something positive. And there are some councils, I know, Vicky.
Well, no, I was going to say, talk about finance and saying that the article I wrote about this last week, which was prompted by the Sunday Times supplement, which Nick made me read from start to finish last weekend. It talked about whether chief execs should actually be incentivized around their, you know, it's ESG, isn't it? The environmental, social and governance issues. So I'm wondering what Helena's view is on that, because we, you know, green finance is now overtaking, you know, traditional finance. And I talked about the case of our council that refused to divest from fossil fuels from the pension fund because it was very niche. And now, 2 years on, I'm thinking this is ridiculous, because that's absolutely what we need to do. But if the CEO is being incentivized and paid according to the performance of the ESG, that's surely how you really buy into it, isn't it, Helena?
Well, I think you make a very compelling point. But what I would say is any CEO that doesn't think that, or CFO that doesn't think they're already incentivized, doesn't really understand the impact of climate change on their business. Because the way we look at it is that our business is all about generating value. How do you generate value for stakeholders in the context of a carbon-constrained economy? And there are two key ways, I would say, a local authority needs to be, or anyone, industry, anyone has to be looking at this. One is from the perspective of what are your stranded assets or potentially stranded assets, and in what time frame do they become stranded assets? And the other one is, what are your potential climate opportunities? How do you look at your asset base and think, how can I actually diversify and increase my revenue by the way I react to this situation or proactively engage with this situation? So let me give you two examples. So some of you know I sit on the regulated board of Places for People, which is the largest private social housing association in the country, 200,000 homes under management. And it's an amazing organisation. About a year ago, I think maybe a bit longer, they started looking at the asset base that they were dealing with. And they categorised the different housing and office and leisure stock according to its potential to become subject to regulation or subject to devaluation because it would no longer be an attractive asset to live in as a consequence of climate change or increased, regulation around environmental aspects, etc. And they looked at their whole portfolio to see what their liquidity risk was. So what are the chances that these properties will be unsellable? What their valuation risk was? What are the chances that these properties would no longer be as valuable as they were before because they're more costly to operate? Or there are, other reasons why climate change has had an impact. And they started to make decisions as to divestment and to upgrading of the stock according to the presumption of further climate regulation and further impacts of climate change affecting their portfolio. And so that stops being, I need an environmental person sitting next to CEO, and it starts being, sorry, CFO, how are you managing the future? Because the future is a carbon-constrained world. And the second example is one from the airport that Johnny and I have been working on in Glasgow. I'm very proud of what they're doing. And they were one of the first airports that grasped, pre-COVID, remember, grasped the importance of revenue diversification. How do you look at your real estate assets as opportunities to monetize them in the context of a carbon constrained world. So how can you use your real estate assets to generate green electrical power? How do you use your assets to for the purposes of delivering a battery that might generate services to the grid? How do you look at selling electricity to perhaps the industry that sits around your airport? How can you use what is a challenge for you as a value generation device, looking at your context and looking at the way in which you use energy? So your cost suddenly becomes a revenue stream. And in post-COVID land, that proved to be very prophetic, because where once upon a time people were like, why would we do that? Energy is a cost. In post-COVID land, people are like, oh, we don't have an airport operating right now. I wish we had a power station. So that's why I totally agree with what you said, Vicky. But anybody who is not thinking that this is actually core to what they do now has not fully grasped the challenge.
But I think that's where I'm sort of coming from with the book, with the greatest respect to everyone who's living and breathing this. As Johnny said, when I was talking about it earlier, sometimes the experts are not the best at communicating the need for it, and that's a frustration that a lot of people have felt. I've certainly witnessed about a year, when I was last out of the country, allowed out and about in the trains and things, a council absolutely flabbergasted, having just spent the evening celebrating climate emergency action being taken by their full council, everyone in the chamber supporting it unanimously, to then have two absolutely charming activists ask them at the cabinet meeting the next morning, so what are you going to do about it now? And we've got to bring everyone together. And I think that one of the things I found with this book, I didn't feel lectured at, I felt educated. I didn't feel nervous, because I had someone who has great inspiration and belief in the future that it's all quite possible, but maybe we need to get you involved now rather than leave people on the sidelines later. And one of the things I think that really a big challenge for this world is, if you look at what has happened with science and finding a vaccines even, we've done amazing. We haven't found one. We've found a whole load of vaccines for COVID-19 in a much shorter period of time. It shows that the creativity and talent of the scientists, when put and given the finance and given the direction and leadership that only a government can, then we can do it. And that gave me great hope when I started to think about that too, what Bill Gates says about, I believe it can be done, but we have to get going.
Soviet though, Nick. Are you advocating central planning?
No, but I think that if you don't bring the governments with you, you're not going to get it at all. So let's not throw anyone out of this party. And I think that one of the other things that I find really interesting is I hadn't got the importance of the timings, putting it in the context of timings overall, and whether the timings are arguable, whether you believe in them. The idea that we've got 9 years to really focus on getting the stepping stones in place, and that government law that exists today can actually hinder innovation and progress, and that we have to get all our governments in the world looking at how they're enabling people like you to move even faster, and others. I think that really brought it home to me about these dates that sound terribly arbitrary at 2030 and 2050. And I'm certainly willing, having read this book, to do my little bit to move this forward and make sure that we have half a chance of responding.
And I'm going to take that, Nick, and use that as a segue, because we're now coming up to the hour mark, which is not too far away, and we still got to get through very, very quickly heroes and hypocrisy, and that discussion. There's a few things in there, Helena. For me, it actually reminded me of a conversation I had with a local authority 12 years ago, where they turned around and said, "Well, energy is not core business to me," and I had their energy bill in front of me, and my response to them was, "Well, I can see it is core business. I can see what your energy bill looks like," and that's scary when you look at that. So it's just a simple shift of a dial of what is core business and what good looks like is a very simple outcome. We're moving on now to, and we're going to start with the hypocrisy of the month, which I'm going to pick up before picking over to Vicky on hero. And this month, this is really quite simple actually. It was an article was sent over to me, and it just reminded me and us about why we talk about hypocrisy. And it's not to stick there and point the finger at people, but you can't understand the future, and you can't understand the problems unless you're willing to talk about the problems. It's all well and good talking about successes all the time, but we've also got a whole range of problems out there that we need to reflect on. And actually, there was a great interview with Professor Mike Bernal-Lees from Lancaster University, who pointed this out. Actually, don't be scared of hypocrisy. We need to talk about hypocrisy, and in particular, don't let it put you off, because it's very easy to be stymied by somebody pointing the finger at you, and especially if you're nervous about a subject and a market area, if you're a business perhaps that you're just feeling your way through. If you're always constantly worried about somebody pointing the finger at you about hypocrisy, you're never going to move forward. So let's celebrate the success, let's celebrate doing the right thing, but let's also understand the parts of this that makes hypocrisy happen. The article, actually, there was an article in CNN which was pointing the finger at the United Kingdom and Norway as being hypocrites, because we'd recently celebrated some success about kind of like the European country that has decarbonized the quickest, or decarbonized our power infrastructure the fastest. And this article essentially, well, yeah, but look, you do this over here, but you do that. Now, if we all focused on the but, then we wouldn't move forward. And then also we know this is going to happen, but we've got COP26 coming up in November. Somebody's going to go, oh, look at the hypocrisy of all of these people flying from around the world to an event in Glasgow. Well, you know, we need people to come together. They need to break bread. They need to be able to do a deal, especially on Article 6 about who pays, which we talked about in last month's show. So there is elements of this that we can't be stymied by hypocrisy, but let's carry on talking about those and let's move forward, and then work out how do we unpick that hypocrisy and put plans together at a stepping stone, one at a time, to move these things forward. And a problem shared is a problem halved, isn't it? So really moving on from that and to celebrate the heroes, Vicky, this is important, because when we can put people up on a pedestal and go, look at the amazing things that this is going on just here, the more we can learn as well. So over to you, Vicky, hero of the month for you.
So what was quite interesting was that until a couple of days ago, when I was asked to read a 610-page document, note to self, I haven't read the whole thing, but I've tried to absorb as much as I can at the same time as getting through this very good book Bill Gates has written. Until a couple of days ago, I was quite keen on the hero of the month not being a human, because you know, and actually that's a bit of a segue to who our hero is, because you know, nature is actually the biggest hero in all of this, isn't it? And so I was quite keen until recently that cottoniester was going to be my hero of the month. And Keith is looking horrified, obviously hasn't seen the article, that basically that wonderful plant that's in all our suburban gardens has been found to be 20% more efficient than most other plants in dealing with roadside pollution. Now, as a former council leader who has arguments about how long the grass is, if you could plant these things down the sides of all of our roads, you would not only deal with air pollution and increase biodiversity, you'd get rid of the problem of cutting the damn grass. Brilliant. And then along came Sir Partha Dasgupta and absolutely screwed my idea of making cottoniester the hero of the month. And that was in his wonderful piece, which was The Economics of Biodiversity. And I think it brings us straight back round to what Helena was saying, and that is, when you put nature into economic terms, lots more people start getting it. And we've had this about, you know, how do you put social value? How do you capture all of that? And one of the things that Sir David Attenborough says in his introduction to the report is that nature is our home, and good economics demands that we manage it better. And this whole report, which is absolutely fascinating, and I'm, you know, if you could turn it into a book, we could perhaps give it to Nick to read it, but it uses the language of economics. So it talks about nature being our global portfolio of assets. you use that language, Helena's clients will be lapping it up. It talks about supply and demand, and it basically says that we have to do three things. First of all, humanity must ensure that demand does not exceed supply, and that we help nature to increase the supply. That seems fairly obvious with my Keynesian brain on. Then we have to change the measure of economic success so that it's a sustainable model. And the third thing we have to do, and this bit's critical, is we have to transform our institutions and our system, namely our finance and our education system, to enable and sustain the change. Because if we don't actually get the future generations continuing to buy into it, the rest of it's a load of rubbish. So, it nearly was Courtney Aster. Elon Musk had a little bit in there with Mars, but yeah, Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, I think, hats off to you, sir. You are our hero of the month.
Fantastic.
Can I just throw in one other little hero for me? Because when Jenny and I were talking about Nick's book review, I was suggesting that we all talk about what book changed our lives.
Yeah.
And Vicky, there is a book that you should read if you enjoyed the work that you just spoke about. It's called Natural Capitalism. It's by Paul Hawken. And I read it when I was 18 years old, and it changed my life because he was the first popular author to talk about the three things that you just talked about. And he was the person who invented the concept of energy as a service, or whatever product as a service, the idea of changing the economic relationships we have from asset ownership to service provision, changed the way we conceptualized value, and therefore led to the beginning of the circular economy. And so while we are still talking about those things, I am now 42, so that was quite a while ago. And yeah, I would urge anybody who wants a flashback to what we were saying then, read Natural Capitalism.
Righty-ho, I shall do that once I've finished Bill Gates.
Yeah, one book at a time. Yeah, and
I've got to go back to a thriller after this. I need some escapism.
What science fiction thriller?
So Johnny, I just wanted, as we were closing, just to draw this back, because we started this webinar talking about the choices that we all need to make in terms of infrastructure and what we need to be investing in and the priorities that we need to put in, and we were framing that around FIDIC's recent report. And Helena said something really interesting to me right early in your interview about, this isn't about the tech, but it's about how we adapt the infrastructure to be able to work with the tech as it develops. Because we have, we've built the world that sits around us, and now all of a sudden we're going to start using it in a different way. And so my question really is, how do we make that sexy to do? In Boris Johnson's world of Build Back Better, there's an awful lot of stuff that we need to do, I think, that is around adaptation of infrastructure rather than big new kit. And if that's the case, how do we make it sexy so that becomes part of our future agenda?
And answer that question in 1 minute, Helena.
Well, my hero of the month was going to be the weather in Texas, because the way in which you make this sexy is you look at what has just happened with a once in 100-year event happening every year, and you suddenly realize the costs that would be associated of not transforming our infrastructure, because Texas has some of the largest wind farms in the world, the most advanced technology in the world, but their grid infrastructure is aching. And they are not connected as a system to the rest of the United States. And so if you want an example of something, that should be a Hollywood film and therefore is very sexy to avoid, then you only have to look at how important infrastructure is in that instance.
And a point well made by Bill Gates as well. It's exactly a problem he identified. You're going to agree with him so much in this book.
Well, I think we need to do.
Just back Nick up there, he does talk about how the isolationism of the different places in America is actually undermining how we get through this problem, and that's exactly what I read about Texas. They don't share and trade.
They have groaning state infrastructure, but they don't have resilient microgrids. So they don't have the good things that come in small packages.
Yeah.
And you only have to look at the energy bills of consumers in Texas at the moment to find out what the capital cost to the individual person is on where things go wrong. We won't make any
comment about how the politicians are dealing with it, because it's not going well.
Yeah, a tricky one. Well, time is to an end. It takes me great pleasure, Helena, to say thank you very much for joining us today. Everything you've said is very insightful. Brilliant. And as ever, just fantastic. And on behalf of everybody here, what has the environment ever done for us? We look forward to speaking to you next month, and I think by means of highly fantastic segues, Vicky, I believe next month we will be talking about nature. Thank you all.